Hello everyone, Adam Jacobs here from the Federal team, Senior Solution Architect, here to talk to you about the plug and play master calendar that I built with the option to add fiscal year. This is very useful for people who need to figure out how to fill in missing dates within their data, as well as being able to just automatically apply tags for things that are within the current month to date, previous month to date, previous year to date, fiscal year to date, etc. All sorts of fields that are great to have within your data for doing analysis that can be generated automatically using this script. So let's go ahead and dive right in. So all the materials you're going to need are right here on community.click.com. Just search for master calendar script with optional fiscal year, an explanation of what exists as well as the actual files can be found down here. All you need to do to get access to these is download this zip file and you're ready to go. So let's do that now. So now that we've downloaded that, we have two files that exist. There is a variables file and a script file. We are going to utilize those in just a minute, but first, let's take a look at the data we're going to use this against. We're going to start with a pretty simple data set here, where we have all these different events that are tagged with different IDs, ID numbers 1 through 8, and each of these events have a specific date associated with them, so we can see when the event took place. Now you'll notice right now our data only has those specific events, but what if we need to fill in all the dates in between? That can be difficult to do without the use of a master calendar. So that's exactly what we're going to do, and we're going to go into the script in order to accomplish this. So here we have the inline load that gives us the dates that we are going to be working with. Okay, it's just a simple 8-line load here for the 8 different events and the dates associated with each. And then what I did was, from that zip file, I copied the context of master calendar variables, and I just pasted those contents right into this script right here. Okay, so this has 5 variables in it that we can set. The first is just defining the fact table. Fact table being the table that has the date in it that we are going to use to generate our master calendar. So in this case, the table name right here is just called table. So I'm going to go ahead and enter that in here. So that is called table. Next, we have the option to set a fiscal calendar. So right now, the default is 0, where no fiscal calendar gets set. Okay. For now, we're going to leave this at 0 just to see what a regular generation of a script will look like. But if we did set that fiscal variable to 1, that turns on the fiscal calendar. And then what we can do is we can set which month of the year our fiscal calendar starts with. By default, I have this selected to October. And so October would be month 1 in our fiscal calendar. Again, we're going to leave this fiscal blank for now, and I'm going to move on to the 2 date fields that we can enter. So date field 1 is the date field that has the earliest date that we want in our master calendar. Again, we have to define when our master calendar is going to start and when it's going to end. So this is the field that defines when it starts. And if we look back at our table that we're working with here, we have just date, and the first date is January 1st, 2018. So this here, date, is the field that has the earliest date in our master calendar. So we're going to enter date. If we look at date field 2, this is the date field that contains the latest date in our master calendar. Now, because that is actually the same date as the date field 1 as our earliest date, we actually don't have to enter anything. We can just leave it blank and we'll be fine. So let's talk about what exactly these variables are now populating within our script. So if we move to the next section, this is where I copied the context of master calendar script copied those contents and I pasted it right here inside this. And there's a lot going on here. So let's break this down into different sections. This first section here is just a little if then else statement that helps define a few things. Number one, it helps figure out um, is there a separate date field for the maximum date, or is it the same as the date field for the minimum date? Whether you left it blank or you entered the same date field in both date field 1 and 2, if in our situation right now where we do have just a single date field, what that does is that first it by default just automatically sets vDateField 2 to the same thing as vDateField 1, and it avoids running an interval match. And so we'll see that later, but this is another variable that derives later on in the script. If we had set a date field 2 that was different than date field 1, then we would actually turn on the interval match. Again, we'll talk about what that looks like a bit later. The second part here is actually loading in what is the minimum and the maximum date from our fact table. Notice that we are calling that variable v fact table, so this would then equal our table named table. The minimum date is calling vDateField1. The maximum date is calling vDateField2, which in our situation currently, these are actually the same field. So it's just going to figure out what's the minimum date and what's the maximum date from that table. And then we use what's called a peak function to generate a variable for each. And so what we'll end up having is we'll have a variable for the min date and a variable for the max date. And so those are going to be something that we will call on in our next section. Once we have those two variables, we no longer need the temp table that we had just loaded in here. So we go ahead and we drop that. Below that, we have what's called the temp calendar. And this is actually the most important part of our master calendar here, because what it's using is it's using an iter_no function and an auto-generate function along with a while to generate all the different dates between our minimum date and our maximum date. So both these two here are important for generating, starting with the minimum date, whether that be the number or the date itself, and adding a number all the way up as and continuing on to add a number to that date as we move forward. And so as it keeps adding that, it adds in a date. So it goes from January 1st to January 2nd to January 3rd to January 4th, etc. And how it knows to stop is that it uses this auto-generate, and it auto-generates 1 every time, so it's adding 1 each time, as long as the variable for the minimum date plus the iteration number minus 1 is less than or equal to the maximum date. In other words, this is going to keep doing this all the way until we get to that maximum date. The next section here is just a little if statement that helps with something else. So we're going to use the var max date to help generate for understanding when we are, which month we are currently in today. What this is doing is that this is saying that if we are using some dates that happen to be in the future, we still want to generate the calendar going out into the future. However, we want to make sure that when we are saying, hey, what year are we in, what month are we in, what day are we in, etc., that we are actually using the current date as opposed to a date in the future to generate that. So what we're doing is we're resetting the maximum date to a new date as long as the maximum date that we had before is actually greater than the date for today. If it's not, the variable for maximum date doesn't get affected. Now, the next is where we are going to work with our fiscal year. So we have another if statement where we're saying if there is not a fiscal year, then we are going to use this script here to generate all of these different dates that are going to be important to us. So here we have, we're starting with generating temp date as the date. We're generating the year, the month, the day, the week, rolling months here is being generated automatically. And then using a preceding load, we're generating various in current month, in month to date, in prior month to date, in last year month to date. Or we have the same thing for quarters here, looking at the different quarters, and creating flags for those as well as for the years. So all of this gets automatically generated when we run through this script. If the fiscal year is turned on, Click is going to ignore this part of the script from lines 29 all the way through to line 80 here, and then we are going to actually start with line 84. So it's going to use the variable for fiscal fiscal start month. It's going to create a new variable called fiscal date difference, and it is going to figure out what's the difference between the fiscal start month and the normal year, and then it's going to load in all of the same things we were looking at before, plus various uh, fiscal fields. So in current fiscal year to date, as well as just in current year to date, in current fiscal quarter to date, as well as just in current quarter to date, etc. Also, we are generating the fiscal month, the fiscal year in long form, the fiscal year in short form, week, the fiscal week, and looking again at the rolling dates. And that goes all the way here to line 155. And then finally, this last section here, this is going to generate what's called an interval match. Let's take a minute to skip over this for now because we are not going to do an interval match in our first load here because we're only using a single date field. That interval match actually gets activated when we have two date fields in our script. So for now, let's go ahead and click Load Data, and let's see what happens. So now, if we return to Analysis, now you'll notice that our table is filled out a lot more. We still have exactly when these various events occurred. So we still have January 1st, 2018 for that first event, but you'll notice our data now has more dates in it. Here's that second event, but every single date between our first event and our last event is now filled. Not only that, if we actually go into edit mode and take a look at our fields, now we have all of these different fields that we can use that are date fields that can be important for our analysis. So that's what happens when we have a single date field and when we keep the fiscal calendar off. Let's take a look at what happens when we have more than one date field, as well as when we turn the fiscal calendar on. So we're back in our script, and what I've done is I've gotten rid of the previous inline load, and I've loaded in a new table. This table has 4 projects, and they each have and the project has a start date and an end date. Okay, so what we're trying to do is not only figure out how to generate all of the dates between our start date and our earliest start date and our last end date, but we also want to determine which projects occur are still going on during any given date in our calendar. All right, because right now, if we loaded this in, all we would see is when the start date is, when the end date is, and it would be pretty hard to determine, well, hey, how many projects are going on at the same time at any given point or something like that. That can be hard to do without the use of a master calendar. So let's go into our variables and let's edit our variables to account for our new table. So the table, it's still called table. We're leaving that alone. We are going to turn on the fiscal year, and we'll have the fiscal year start month as month 10, so that's October. Now, if we look at our date field 1 and date field 2, those are called start date and end date. So I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to edit this to be start date. I'm going to edit this one to be end date. So now that we have 2 different date fields, what this is going to do in our script is it is going to actually set our interval match variable to 1. So what that's going to do is down here at the bottom, once we've loaded our master calendar, it is going to call this section of an if statement, if interval match equals 1. So what it's going to do is it's going to use an interval match function. And what an interval match function does is that it will take a field, in this case we're going to take date, and we're going to say we're going to take the two different date field 1 and date field 2 that we entered before, so the start date and the end date for each of our different projects from that fact table. And so what that's going to do is going to join these together. And then finally, what we want to do to avoid a synthetic key is we are going to then join our master calendar to our fact table and drop the master calendar. So now actually in our data, we're going to see that the master calendar is actually no longer there. It is actually just joined with our original data table. And so when we go ahead and we load the data, okay, what that ends up doing is that ends up providing us an application where we can see how these different project IDs line up with the dates in between the start and end. What we'll see is that the interval match has actually said, hey, project ID started on January 1st and it continues on all the way through to about April 22nd, but if you'll notice, project 2 starts February 19th. And so now I can see there's overlap between those two before we continue on with just project 2 and before there's an overlap with project 3 starting in July. And so you'll see that now I can see when these projects are actually taking place on any given date, and I can see on any given date that yes, there is a project going on at that point. If we go into edit mode, what we're going to see is that our fields now have a number of different fiscal fields that we can take advantage of. In last year fiscal quarter to date, for example, and last year month to date, that was already in the prior fiscal year quarter to date. All of these are going to be useful for helping me out with determining which fiscal year, week, month, etc., and comparing different time periods together. So that's really useful. Now, let's talk about what happens if we have a start date and an end date, but they exist in two different tables. Okay, so here we are back in our script. And what we have here is we have two different tables. Right? So we have a start table and an end table. Okay, and with these two tables, we also have order IDs that do match with each other. So order ID 1, 2, 3, 4, order ID 1, 2, 3, 4. But here, this is essentially the order table where we have, hey, what date was the order placed? So we have those dates listed here. And then in our end table, we have what date were they shipped. So this can be very useful for also even figuring out how many days were between the order date and the ship date? And on any given date, had a order been ordered but not shipped, which is a good thing for someone to be able to understand. Okay, now one of the things to note, and we call this out in our variable script, is that note that if the earliest date and the latest date exist in two separate tables, what we want to do is we actually want to combine those tables together. So we want to do what's called a join. This is going to just make things easier for us when creating this master calendar, and it will allow the script to function correctly. So what we'll do back in our tables here is instead of having this called end table, let's just say I'm going to left join to start table. Okay, so I'm going to left join to start table. Now I've got to edit my variables. So the table that we are going to be working with is called start table. We have order date, so we're going to change this first one to order date. And then we have shipped date. Let's double check that ship date is correct. It is actually ship date. There we go. Now, one last thing that I think is pretty neat that we can do here. So we have that master calendar script that we downloaded as a text file. If you put that in a place that Click can access it through a data connection, then one of the things you can do is you can use what's called an include function to just automatically call that script into Click. And so here, instead of having a very long script that we're working with, okay, what we're doing is we are just going to include that script using this include function. So it's including from the connection that master calendar script text file. And that's going to actually call the entire script that I had copied and pasted earlier. And it's just cleaner. And it means that this is something that we can edit in one place and can be used in multiple applications and changed in multiple applications simultaneously. Very useful for making sure that things are calculated the same way that we want to calculate the fiscal years, for example, as the same calculation. Okay, so let's go ahead and load data and see what happens with this. So now, when we do that, we go back to analysis. We can again see we've got our ordered IDs. We can see when it was ordered. We could add the ship date here to this particular column here, or order date, I mean, to this particular column, and we can add as well the ship date. So we can see that, yes, the ship date and the order date are still assigned, but we can see at any given point that that order still has not been shipped until we reach the exact ship date. Thanks for watching. If you want to access the files that we used in this video that can be used in your own Click applications, please use the link below to get to the community post, which has the zip file that has these files in them. These files, again, they are agnostic. You can use them in any application where you have date fields, so please feel free to do so and use them throughout your organization. Thanks again for watching. Have a good one.